Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the International Labor Organization, commonly called the ILO? How is the United Nations ILO promoting decent work and labor rights as human rights? Today we'll get an update on these very important concepts. My guest today is an expert on the International Labor Organization. Ms. Beate Andrees is the Special Representative to the United Nations and Director of the International Labor Organization Office for the United Nations in New York. Ms. Beate Andrees, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're able to do it today. I really appreciate it. Let's jump right into the ILO. This is the third oldest of the United Nations specialized agencies. In 2019, you had your 100th anniversary. What is the main mission of the ILO?
Well, the ILO was set up at the end of the First World War, as you said, in 1919. And what was current and topical then is still very, very much on our agenda today. And that's to promote labor rights for all people, no matter where they live or no matter where they work, to promote social protection, to promote employment and employability that also includes, of course, skills, and to promote, very importantly, social dialogue, which means we are a tripartite organization. We are actually the only organization in the UN system that consists of more than just governments. We also include what we call workers and employers organizations, but essentially trade unions and business in our governance structure. And we want them to talk to each other. And that's essentially what we call social dialogue.
That is so important, that tripartite arrangement, to have the workers, the business, and the governments involved so that they're all helping to move towards a common goal, which is extremely important. Now, if our viewers would like more information, they can go to www.ilo.org and find out a lot more about your really interesting agency. Well, now the ILO, since its founding, I guess it was in 1919, has four basic pillars. Very briefly, what are those four pillars upon which all of your work is built?
Well, let me start then again with the first pillar, what we call standards, labor rights. It's the normative pillar of the organization. And it was important ever since the ILO was set up to negotiate and to adopt international labor standards, conventions and recommendations. And conventions need to be ratified by member states and then implemented into national law. And the ILO's role as the office is to supervise the implementation, to really followed up by national law, and the rights are also implemented in practice. That concerns, for instance, maternity leave. It concerns the elimination of child labor, or forced labor, the promotion of freedom of association and collective bargaining, the freedom to actually negotiate your wages, for example, collectively, and many more labor rights. The second pillar is I think very important, especially now in the COVID area, but has always been important in crisis times, but also in times of prosperity and growth. It's the promotion of inclusive and productive and freely chosen employment. It's the ability to find employment in your country or also across borders. It's the ability to acquire the skills you need to find meaningful employment. It's to help governments to develop and design employment policies so that you reach also vulnerable groups, for instance, and many more issues that come under this pillar, employment and sustainable enterprises. The other important pillar is related to social protection. And again, here, the COVID crisis, I think, has laid bare the importance of health coverage, the importance of some basic livelihood or income support in times of crisis. And never before has there been so much focus on the issue of what we call social protection floors. And finally, as I said, social dialogue is the ability for the partners of the ILO, the tripartite constituents, the workers' organizations, employers and government, to come together and to negotiate solutions on all kinds of labor market issues.
Which is extremely important. And you mentioned the social safety net, the ability to bargain collectively. These are very important issues for people in the United States and all around the world. Well, let's focus a bit on governments. You talked about governments a moment ago. And of course, we think of the United Nations, you're one of the major UN agencies, a specialized agency, but there are 193 members of the United Nations General Assembly, and basically almost every country in the world is represented at the United Nations. How do you interact with many of those countries, or all of those countries, and what services do you provide to them?
Well, first of all, almost all the UN member states are also members of the ILO. There's a bit of a difference. We have slightly fewer members. Ours are 187, but it's not significant. So essentially, the countries that are members of the UN also make commitments in the ILO. For instance, to implement conventions, international law and practice related to labor rights. So how do we interact with the UN? Let me give you the example again of the COVID crisis. When COVID hit, it was clear very early on that COVID was not just a health crisis, but it was also a massive labor market or employment crisis. And actually in the next coming months, we will see, I believe we will see the impact of COVID even more on the labor market. So the ILO and the ILO's constituents, again, labor ministries, workers, businesses, they've come together in many countries to design these stimulus packages that are there to help business to survive this crisis, help keep employment. And those stimulus packages and those, if you want, active labor market policies are an integral part of what the UN as a whole tries to do in response to COVID-19. So here you see, if the ILO would just act on its own without coordinating with the rest of the UN system, without coordinating with the WHO to start with, it would be counterproductive because policies would be in a silo rather than integrated. So the timing, for instance, of stimulus packages is very important in terms of also the health response. So that's about, just a concrete example how, in particular in times of crisis, we interact with the UN, but of course also on a more regular basis in, if I may say so, times, we are in regular contact with the UN system. In fact, our interaction with the UN goes back to an agreement that was signed between the UN and the ILO in 1946. So we have a long-standing experience collaborating with the UN.
You certainly do, since the UN was just formed in 1945. So that certainly is a very—
Yes, we were the first specialized agency actually to sign an agreement with the UN system.
Oh, is that right? Very good. Yeah. Yes. Well, in the opening, I mentioned about promoting labor rights as human rights. How do you define that? Those are both very important to us, but how do you promote labor rights as human rights or human rights as labor rights?
Well, thank you, Bill. That's a very important question, especially again in these times of crisis where an attack on rights is always a risk, and we've actually seen this in some countries. And there the ILO conventions are, if you want a safeguard to prevent a crisis to degenerate into something worse. So specifically, I mean, I would argue that human beings' struggle for human dignity has always included the struggle to be respected at work, to have dignity at work. These two struggles really go together. And if you look back, for instance, at the global struggle against slavery, the abolition for slavery, which was one of the first human rights struggles, if you want, in recent history, it really paved the way for the emergence of the labor movement in some of those countries, like the United Kingdom. So the labor movement, the struggle for labor rights, has always been very much interlinked with the struggle for basic human rights. Now, we have achieved an official recognition by all member states that fundamental principles in rights at work, the elimination of forced labor, child labor, discrimination, and the promotion of freedom of association, collective bargaining are recognized as human rights, officially recognized. We don't have the same consensus as yet for labor rights more broadly, but we do have sufficient references to, for instance, wages or economic rights in some of the other UN human rights instruments. So one of our roles in New York, and of course with the office as a whole, is to make sure that these linkages are well understood and are promoted across the UN system.
That is extremely important. I'm curious with the labor rights and human rights. Do you find that a large number of the governments and the employers and the labor unions are in agreement with this? Are they very much in support of it generally, or has that attitude changed over the last 20 or 30 years?
Well, the world would probably be a better place if there had been agreement all throughout those years on those.
Yeah, oh yes.
Days. No. I mean,
sure.
there's always a very, I should say constructive, but also contentious debate about the definition and how are these rights being implemented across different countries. I mean, we say that human rights, and in this sense also fundamental principles and rights at work, are universal. You can't negotiate, you can't relativize. They are universally applicable. But what does it mean in practice? What does it mean for a country that has a high, for instance, a high prevalence of child labor, where many small farmers depend on their children's labor to make ends meet? But what does it mean in concrete terms? You can't just, legislate this problem out of the world, even if the government was willing to do so, and even if businesses was willing to do so, and workers, of course, pushing for it. So, in addition to legislation, which obviously is a very strong means, you also need development. You need to support countries to design better policies, to for instance, to provide social protection to those families in need so that they don't need to use their children, just to stay with that particular example. But another very good example is the human rights to be free from violence. Again, universally recognized as a human right. But where does it start and where does it end? We've seen this in recent debates on domestic violence. Is that already universally recognized? There are good arguments, of course, in favor for recognizing it, but there's still debate out there. And the ILO has come with a new instrument in 2019 to call for an end of all violence and harassment in the world of work, just to show that for the ILO, that is part of what we consider to be a fundamental, a fundamental issue to be free from violence at work.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website, you have a computer, you like our shows and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service at no charge to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very interesting United Nations agency, the International Labor Organization. And my guest today is an expert on this agency. Ms. Beate Andrees is the special representative to the United Nations and she is the director of the International Labor Organization Office for the United Nations in New York. We were talking about the ILO and the importance of it. And whenever I talk about any UN activity, I have to flash to the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in, I guess, 2015 and in November, December of 2015, came online in 2016. And it's a 15-year continuum of 17 very laudable goals to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to develop gender equity and equality for women and girls. Where does the ILO tie? I mean, I can see, it seems to me I can see a cross cutting of almost all 17, but which ones do you focus on the most as far as promoting decent work and the work of the International Labor Organization?
Well, first of all, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, were a major milestone in terms of governments recognizing that the world is interconnected. We have problems that require global solutions, and you can't just silo your response, your policy response, whether it's climate change, whether it's what you said, gender equality or poverty, it's all connected. And that's what the SDGs, the so-called SDGs, really recognize. So if I'm now saying, well, our focus is on goal 8, decent work and sustainable economic growth, then yes, that's where our energy is focused, but it means, of course, that we recognize the interconnectivity of our lives. You know, you cannot dissociate, for instance, action on climate change with action on employment. Because focusing on some of the economic sectors like the carbon, high carbon sectors, or what's called the black economy, will result in job losses. But the ILO is arguing in order to promote climate change and you invest in new sectors, you can actually have a net gain of employment, of millions of jobs gained. So this kind of discussion is really important so that we understand that one issue is not really disconnected from the other. But yes, our focus is on decent work, the goal on decent work and economic growth.
Mm-hmm. And as you're absolutely right. And as we look at those 17 goals, it seems as though, especially for the International Labor Organization, which looks at human trafficking, you look at income inequality, you look at just a wide range of issues, that they're all interlinked. And anything that you work on would hopefully help to reduce poverty, would help to reduce hunger, would help to put food on the table, would help to ameliorate or reduce the negative effects of climate change. So you're absolutely right. They are cross-cutting to be very upfront about it. They're very, very important. When we say this concept of decent work, how do you translate that? How do you define it?
Well, first of all, the concept of decent work was not implicitly in the founding documents of the ILO. It's a concept that only evolved in recent years. Actually, starting in the 1990s, when you had more discussion at the global level and UN level on the connection between poverty, social development, and employment. And so the idea emerged that the ILO, to bring the different objectives of the ILO together, namely rights, employment creation, social dialogue, social protection, what we started off earlier, decent work was a good umbrella concept because it embodies the notion of work and the notion of dignity, which we acquire by being recognized, I mean, as a human being, but also having rights, your rights being protected. So the decency, it's not just any type of job. It's not just, you know, having a job that's good enough from an ILO point of view. It has to be decent work, which means your rights are being recognized. You have some social safety net. You have a voice at work, and you also have the ability to acquire meaningful employment, for instance, through skills. it becomes more and more important, of course, with what we call the future of work. It's very clear now that you are not entering a job when you've finished your education and you stay there for the rest of your life. You will make many transitions. And so this idea of decency, decent work throughout the life cycle is becoming more and more important.
It very well may be that once we leave one job and into another, that's when our education really begins again.
Absolutely.
The renovation and
Exactly.
renaissance of education. That's exactly right. And of course, now during the 15 years of promoting the Sustainable Development Goals, and many of them were on track until we got derailed by this horrific COVID problem. But one of the themes was no one left behind. This was to include everyone. And I'm sure that applies to the ILO. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the ILO was always concerned with social justice. I mean, that's actually in our founding principle that, you know, there will be no peace without social justice. So this idea of leaving no one behind is I would say, very much in our DNA.
The UN General Assembly, I think during your centennial year in 2019, they passed a resolution to make 2021 the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. Extremely important and a major problem. It varies from country to country and place to place within countries at times. What can we do during this year of 2021 to focus on this horrific situation of child labor and hopefully to eliminate it?
Well, thank you for this question, Bill, and indeed very timely as we just start this UN year. I think child labor is another example. As you said, we were going in the right direction prior to the COVID crisis. Numbers were declining in many countries. There were strong laws adopted and so on. Then COVID hit, and initial estimations or projections show that child labor is likely to increase again because poverty is increasing. So what do we need to do? I think this year is an opportunity to, first of all, raise awareness, make sure that policies that are now being put in place to fight the pandemic also include children. And actually, more than ever, this is so important because many have missed out on school, on education, and this will have an impact on their future employment opportunities. So we will release new global estimates this year to show the global scale of the problem. Last estimate showed 154 girls and boys were still in child labor. We were hoping that this number would continue decreasing. We are not sure so now, but we will also focus on policy measures so that member states, those that are represented in the UN as well as in the ILO, will really take strong measures, put children really at the center of their COVID responses.
That is going to be so important. And of course, this is a problem that's been with us, and the COVID-19 issue has made it even worse. Well, in our last 30 seconds, what do you consider to be your major challenge as the ILO moves forward?
I would be inclined to say COVID recovery, but actually the much bigger issues looming on the horizon are the climate crisis and what we call the just transition to a green economy. This will be a major effort, and it goes very much with it, the digital transformation in the world as a whole, but also in the world of work. And what does it mean for representation of workers? What does it mean for protection of workers' rights? Big questions. We don't have all the answers yet, but we are really working on understanding and providing good research, good data on those big challenges. It will be on our way now, the key concern, but it's very much linked to the green and digital transformation.
Beate Andrees, Director of the ILO office in New York. I'm so glad you mentioned the climate change, climate disaster that we're dealing with right now, because unless we really get serious about it, all the countries of the world, it could very well be 10, 15, 20 years from now, we'll look back and say COVID was just a minor irritant compared to the devastation taking place. But this is a very important topic. As are all the topics you're dealing with the International Labor Organization. And of course, again, our viewers can go to www.ilo.org. But Beate Andrees, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill Miller. It was a pleasure being here with you.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.